Dakota is not a nation of people. Dakota is a way of life, a manner in which you walk through this world.
Minnesota, or Minnesota Makoche, the land of cloud-tinted waters, is the homeland of the Dakota people.
Dakota relationship to that land is that she's our mother. Our descendants have been here thousands and thousands of years. So every valley, every road, every location has a spiritual connection with us yet.
The Dakota Oyate, or nation, is made up of 7 council fires called Ocheti Shakoi.
The 7 campfires are the 7 stars in the constellation Orion.
The council fires, or bands, are separated into 3 distinct groups. The Eastern Dakota, or Santee, made up of Sisituwa, Bedewakantua, Wakbekute, and Wakbetua. The Middle Dakota, made up of Ihanktua and Ihanktuana, and the Western Dakota, Tituwa.
The Dakota way, we have what's called Mitakuya Owasi, which means all our relatives. Everything that God created is a relative of ours.
Many questions have come up, the Dakota culture, Dakota spirituality or religion. In truth, there is no separation. You cannot be a Dakota without them both being together.
The Eastern Dakota were the first of the Ocheti Shakoi to negotiate with the federal government through treaties. They were also the first to rebel against it. Minnesota's U.S.-Dakota War of 1862 marked the beginning of wars with Ocheti Shakoi nations that did not end until 1890 at Wounded Knee.
This country is still ours spiritually because it is God-given. When God does something, He doesn't take it back.
The land has a memory. Someday someone will be reminded of what happened there, and it probably won't be good.
We're like trees. If we don't know our roots and how we're connected from the very beginning to creation and to God and to the land, if you don't have roots, the tree falls and it dies.
Minnesota Makoche, the land of cloud-tinted waters in the Dakota language, is known today as Minnesota. It has been the homeland of the Dakota people for thousands of years.
Beginning in the 1600s, a steady stream of Europeans, first explorers and traders, eventually settlers, came to the land known today as the state of Minnesota.
Settlers were very much a threat to Dakota way of life. They were encroaching onto their livelihood.
The German settlers in Chicago and in Cincinnati were told, once you cross the Mississippi, nobody lives there.
By 1862, Dakota people faced many hardships. And when the U.S. government broke its promises, some of the Dakota people went to war.
When the U.S. government, who made a pact with us, will not live up to its agreement, we have to then defend ourselves.
The fighting lasted 6 weeks, and many people on both sides were killed.
It impacted everyone in one way or another. It impacted the Civil War in some small way.
2 whole ways of life were clashing, and one was going to lose out.
Descendants of those touched by the war continue to live with the trauma it caused.
You can't just say, oh, I'm going to forget about this. It'll go away. It doesn't go away.
They're never going to give back the land. That's never going to happen. I just want my grandchildren to know what happened and use it to be stronger in their lives.
The Minnesota Historical Society has collected evidence, objects, photos, diaries, letters, and government documents for more than 150 years. This interactive website tells stories about the war, its causes, and its aftermath. The site provides resources for classroom use, as well as links to materials for deeper research. As you examine the evidence presented here, consider what it reveals, not only about the war, but also about how our view of the past is formed by the things we choose to keep and the stories we choose to tell.
In every tragedy, you look for that lesson to be learned. We are a peaceful people and very resilient. We bounce back from anything.
We didn't own the land, so they belonged to everybody. And so we were willing to share with others that we felt needed. It was used against us. The generosity was used against us.
Dakota and Ojibwe people first encountered Europeans when French explorers, traders, soldiers, and missionaries traveled to the northwestern part of the land now known as Minnesota. Many traders married Indian women, creating kinship networks important to trade and cooperation. Interested in expanding U.S. territory, the U.S. government signed treaties with Indian nations. Missionaries influenced Indian people to adopt Christianity, a tactic they thought necessary for the Indians' survival. Other European immigrants settled in the area in large numbers. By 1854, the Euro-American population of Minnesota Territory was more than 30,000, and just 3 years later, it topped 150,000.
You go into this area, set up a homestead or something, and then it's yours.
Many of our people had to leave Germany because of oppression and many problems.
They promised land of milk and honey, so they came here to find it.
This influx of new people and varying relationships would change the Dakota homeland forever.
Regardless of whatever happened to the Germans, they were encroaching on our way of life, our lands.
The German settlers in Chicago and in Cincinnati were told, once you cross the Mississippi, nobody lives there.
Many factors caused the U.S. Dakota War. In the 1860s, more and more settlers were flooding into Minnesota. Game animals were getting scarce, and there was growing competition between Dakota people and Euro-Americans hunting for meat. Crops had been poor in 1861, and the Dakota had little food stored for the winter.
They were starving because they were not allowed to go off the ridge to hunt. So when the game left for the plains, they had nothing left.
The payments that Dakota had been promised from selling their land to the U.S. government were late. Traders were nervous, and many of them cut off credit to Dakota hunters. A government agent refused to distribute food to the Dakota, and although Dakota farmers shared food with their relatives, it wasn't enough.
When the U.S. government, who made a pact with us, will not live up to its agreement, we have to then defend ourselves.
Our ancestors fought for our survival. They had to go to war to fight for survival. If they wouldn't have fought, we would all just died. We would have starved to death.
On August 17, 1862, 4 hungry Dakota hunters killed 5 white settlers at Acton Township, Meeker County. Some Dakota seized that moment to declare war on the whites who would not keep their promises and to reclaim their homelands. In the early morning hours of August 18th, they went to war.
The Indians attacked the wrong people. They should have attacked the federal government and the fort, but they didn't. The Indians attacked unarmed whites, defenseless, generally peace-loving people.
Over the next 6 weeks, a series of attacks, raids, and battles in the Minnesota River Valley and beyond left thousands dead, wounded, captured, and displaced.
What if a foreign country was encroaching onto your land? Would you retaliate, or would you keep moving and let them take your land? We need to see the minds of the Dakota in saying that we are warriors.
During the war, Dakota people and settlers alike had seen their homes and families torn apart. The trauma didn't end when the fighting stopped. 38 Dakota men were hanged in the largest mass execution in U.S. history. Months dragged into years of imprisonment, destitution, displacement, and death.
9 of our family was sent to Fort Snelling, and then the rest escaped.
And there must have been a lot of them that died there. And what happened to them?
Fort Snelling, it's a place that should be remembered, but there is immense sadness there.
In 1819, the U.S. Army built a fort at the junction of the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers, a place that is the sacred center of the Dakota homeland. Fort Snelling would go on to become a site of major significance in U.S. and state history. But in the turbulent wake of the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862, the fort would also become, for more than 1,700 Dakota people, a place of disease, brutality, and death. In early November 1862, U.S. soldiers gathered these survivors of the conflict, mostly women, children, and elders who had surrendered, and forced them to march from the Lower Sioux Agency to Fort Snelling, a distance of more than 100 miles. Unlike the more than 300 captured Dakota warriors, most of these survivors had not been sentenced to death or prison, but they were to be held at an internment camp, surrounded by a high stockade and located on flat land below the fort. Here they would spend a harsh winter, awaiting their fate.
That confluence of the Mississippi and Minnesota River is a really important site to Dakota people because it marks another geographic and ancient sacred place. And then on top of that, it's where the concentration camp was and where people were imprisoned. So it has a bittersweet connotation there. It's a place of rebirth and birth, but it's also a place of great tragedy.
Armed soldiers and angry white settlers harassed and brutalized the Dakota interned at the site. Visiting missionaries worked to convert the Dakota to Christianity. Estimates of deaths in the camp that winter range from 100 to 300, mostly due to outbreaks of measles and other diseases.
And there must have been a lot of them that died there. And what happened to them? Expendable, I guess.
In spring 1863, U.S. government officials declared that almost all Dakota were to be exiled permanently from the state. Steamboats took the internment camp survivors to the barren Crow Creek Reservation, more than 400 miles west. Today, the site of the Dakota internment camp is part of Fort Snelling State Park and serves as a place of remembrance and education.
The memories of all the old people are still present in the land. There's no way one person could say exactly what happened at Fort Snelling. It's something that should have never happened.
Acts of Congress in 1863 revoked all treaties between the U.S. government and the Dakota. This meant that all but a few protected groups of Dakota were exiled from Minnesota. Minnesota's Ho-Chunk Indians, though not involved in the war, were also expelled from the state.
They were taken by barge down the Mississippi and then up the Missouri, up to Crow Creek. And that was a desolate place, and a lot of people died.
My family scattered everywhere. Sioux Valley, Pipestone Creek, Crow Creek, Santee, Flandreau.
Many Dakota were considered fugitives after the war, and the government began paying bounties for Dakota scalps.
Being Dakota means that you were guilty before any consideration of being innocent.
Families were torn apart, and I just wonder how my relatives made it through all of that.
In the spring of 1863, a military campaign against the Dakota moved west. Expeditions drove the Dakota and their relatives further and further west of the Missouri River, and after 1865, turned into a long series of wars with the Western Dakota and Lakota, ending with the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890.
to be Dakota and Minnesota, what they went through, it overwhelms me. It takes me to why my people are the way they are today, why we haven't healed. It takes me back to praying for those ancestors. I'm here because they survived.